Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on the topic of implementing flexible working for a thriving, age-inclusive workplace. The Diversity Project is delighted to be supporting the launch of the new report by TimeWise and the Center for Aging Better. For those who don't know me, my name is Anna Maria Tuliak. I'm a partner at Ludgate Search, a specialist investment management executive search firm, and I lead the smart working efforts at the Diversity Project. If you have been following our initiatives or attended any of our webinars this year, you will know that promoting flexible working best practice is really at the heart of our mission. So why does today's topic matter to the Diversity Project and our industry specifically? Offering sustainable flexible working and contractual flexibility by default, whilst encouraging and supporting career progression of all employees, it's an extremely powerful tool for creating and cultivating inclusion and diversity across gender, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity, and age among all levels, and especially your management and leadership teams. Even in the pre-COVID-19 world, if we can still remember those times, numerous studies identify flexible working as an enabler to improve organizational diversity and inclusion. And this has prompted us to launch a program with TimeWise last year. We have recently published a Smart Working Manifesto for Change, outlining explicit actions we believe firms in our industry should take in order to adopt a more sustainable approach to flexible working. And this is available on our website. So workplace flexibility can take many forms, as we know, including flexibility in location, which a lot of us are experiencing right now, working hours, and also contractual flexibility. But it essentially empowers individuals to work in the ways that are most productive for them and the business. So implementing effective flexible working practices enables organizations to tap into a new pool of diverse talent and break the stereotype of having to work 9 to 5 or more, 5 days a week in the office, a system that was never fit for individuals with varied circumstances, which ultimately limited the type of talent most organizations attracted. It's, however, really important to acknowledge that the perceived flexible working we're experiencing at the moment, it's not exactly the best ground to cultivate best practice, but the current crisis can and absolutely should be used as a catalyst. Our world has changed, and from a long-term perspective, we really need to balance the social interaction and collaboration benefits you get from working together in person with the flexibility embedded in core of organizational culture. A number of firms in our industry have really seized this moment of uncertainty to accelerate change and have made great progress on their flexible working journeys. Panther Southall Aspire, Reddington, Artemis, Fidelity International, Schroders, just to name a few. We're actually also showcasing a number of these firms on our Diversity Project website. So if you haven't checked the case studies, please, I would encourage you to do so. Economists, politicians, and business leaders agree that the crisis will have an uneven economic impact, with minorities, women, and older workers among the hardest hit. And there is a great deal of work to do to address issues in the workplace that are holding businesses back. And this work really needs to focus on recruiting and retaining people based on their ability, capabilities, and potential, not their age. And before I hand over to Emma, it's also worth mentioning that our executive sponsor is Steve Butler, Chief Executive at Panther Southall Aspire. He's an industry diversity campaigner who's also a regular writer on intergenerational working, retirement, and older worker business management issues. He has in fact recently published a book called The Midlife Review, A Guide to Work, Wealth and Wellbeing, which I would really highly recommend. So in this book, he explores how to prevent an exodus of midlife talent and also urges businesses not to treat age as a barrier, but embrace the benefits of an older workforce. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Anna Maria. Great to be partnering with you as always. Thank you everyone for joining. Apologies for a few tech hiccups at the beginning. Us older workers are adapting still to the ways of technology. We're having a debate just now about what an older worker is in terms of age, and I think I'm a year off officially, so we should do a poll at some point to work it out. Anyway, I'm Emma Stewart. I am co-founder and chief exec of Timewise, and as Anna Maria said, we have been a strategic partner with the Diversity Project for the last year, and we've done a couple of pieces of work with them, and we have been delighted to produce the co-produce the Manifesto for Change with the Smart Working Group. Today, we have you with us for about an hour and a half. We know everybody is zoomed out at the moment, so we may finish slightly earlier and give you 15 minutes to go and get a cup of tea and rest your eyes. But really the purpose of today is to share with you the insights from a piece of work that we have been doing with the Centre for Aging Better on how to look at ensuring that older workers can access flexible work in the same way that everybody can access flexible work. And I think that multi-generational inclusive age spotlight is really, really important. Obviously, suffice to say, the world has changed since we started this project. We've been running it for 18 months. You could argue that everybody is working flexibly now. I guess one of the things that we want to talk to you about today is there's a big gap between an enforced pandemic form of remote working and a truly sustainable, inclusive approach to flexible working. And some of the things that hopefully we will talk to you about today will help you to think through how to bridge that gap, which is about getting that culture right, and it's about getting management capabilities right, and it's about being inclusive in how you talk to everybody in your organisation about being able to manage work and life outside of work, and also being able to maximise performance. So, the format for today is, so I will be chairing the discussion. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Patrick Thompson and Muriel Tisago. Patrick is Senior Programme Manager at Centre for Aging Better and oversees much of their programme of work. And he will start by talking to you a little bit about why all this matters. Muriel, who is Senior Consultant at Timewise, will then talk to you a little bit more about what we did and what we learned. After Patrick and Muriel, we're delighted to have Philip Anderson with us, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Legal and General Retirement's Institutional Division. And Phil will, we were really, really pleased in this project that we did a piece of research, but then we worked importantly with two major employers on the ground with a team of older workers and their managers, and Legal and General participated in that project. As you will all know, Legal and General have been really committed to flexible working for a very long time. This was really fascinating to look particularly at an older worker cohort, and Phil will share some reflections, I think, of the experience, and also what Legal and General are doing now in the context of older workers and adapting to the COVID environment that we are in. Then, once you've heard from all of us, we will open it up for a Q&A, which I will chair. I'll probably pose some questions to the panel, and then we would be delighted if you would like to ask us questions as well. In terms of just a bit of housekeeping, you all know how it works now. Thank you. You are all, I hope, on mute. If you have questions for us as we go along, please put them in the chat function or the Q&A function, and we will make sure when it comes to the Q&A, if you're happy, we would love to hear from you. You can unmute yourself and ask the question in person, or I'm happy to ask the question as well. Without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Patrick, who is going to kick us off, and Muriel, if you can upload the deck, and then Patrick, the ball is with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us and for introducing Emma. And good afternoon, delighted to be here today. Today is very timely. I mean, not only is it's National Inclusion Week, today is actually also International Day of Older People, if you didn't know that. And also very timely because we've also launched our new toolkit with Timewise on supporting flexible working for over 50s. Just a bit of background on us at the Centre for Aging Better. We're an independent charity. We're funded by the Big Lottery, and we're a what works centre. So that means we try and find out what works by working with employers, leading employers like Legal and General, who we'll hear from, but also crucially experts like Timewise. And it's all about finding out how we can maximise the benefits of our longer working lives. As you probably know, we are all, on average, living and working for longer. We've got 1 in 3 workers in the UK aged over the age of 50, and that's been the age group who's seen the biggest growth in employment over the last 20 years. And yet, as we've found, often employers don't always know how best to approach age or generations at work. And this means that too many people leave work earlier than they would like to, and that's borne out in the figures. So 80% of people are in employment at the age of 50, yet less than half of them are still working by the time they reach state pension age. And that means that employers miss out on the skills, the know-how, and of most of their most experienced workers. So we feel something needs to change here. And you may have noticed, as we've already discussed, we are living in times of dramatic change, and we think that flexible working can be key to moving on to whatever the new normal may look like. So just moving on to my first slide, we think that flexible working is key to this. So that's why, absolutely why we're working with TimeWise. We're leading on working in the area of promoting good quality flexible working. We know it is something that matters to all age groups. So from the youngest people in the workplace to the oldest, everyone by and large thinks that flexible working matters. Many more people want it than can access it. But we've also found that people over the age of 50, even though they want it, often don't get access to it in the same way that other age groups do. And that was really why we wanted to look further in this research and pilot at finding out why that was and what we can do to address it. And looking at the next slide, we know this really matters to all ages, but particularly people in their 50s and 60s. This is looking at what retired people say would have helped them more than anything else to work for longer. And all the things there, all the top reasons are in and around flexible working, whether it's about part-time working, whether it's about how, when and where we work, taking on different or less demanding roles, moving to flexible retirement. All these things are really important. They mean different things to different people, but they all are crucial to supporting people to work for longer in the way that suits them. And looking at the next slide, we know this is important because there are challenges. So we know that the older you are at work, the more likely you are to have a health condition, the more likely you are to have a caring responsibility, the more likely you are to face ageism in the workplace. All these factors mean that people drop out of work earlier than they would like to, but crucially, flexible working can help all of these things, and yet it simply isn't always available. So again, looking at TimeWise data there, 85% of job ads do not offer any form of flexible working, so that's at the point of hire. But even for staff and long-standing employees, they're not being offered it either. So 4 out of 5 line managers have never proactively raised flexible working at an annual appraisal, and yet people's circumstances, wants and needs change, and particularly if you think of the last 6 months, people's expectations about work and their needs have certainly changed a huge amount. So we think flexible working needs to be there to support them. And next slide, please, Muriel. And this matters for employers because it matters to individuals, but employers also need to support flexible working as well. So nearly a quarter of employers don't think their organisation is prepared for an ageing workforce. And if you just clicked again, Muriel, it really matters because this is the growth area, particularly. I've already said it's been the growth area over previous decades, but we also forecast that by 2025, we're going to see 300,000 fewer workers under the age of 30 and 1 million more over the age of 50 in the UK. So workplaces need to adapt to this changing age demographic. And if you think of being a workforce manager or a finance manager, whoever you might be, this is the one thing you know about your workforce is it's going to be getting older on average. And there are certainly things that we can be planning and preparing for now, and yet often too many employers are missing out on some of those opportunities. And I think it's the next slide, last slide for me here. And I suppose just to sum up, I mean, we are living in very, very strange times. A lot of it has been helped and aided by technology, but there have been huge changes with COVID-19. As Emma said there, we started this project 18 months ago. No one foresaw what was going to be coming, and this project has evolved a bit as we've gone along. And there have been good and bad sides to all of it as well. So, I mean, certainly there have been huge challenges here. So we have issues around presenteeism, even at home, and we know that flexible working can be good for that, but if it's not managed well, it can be detrimental to people's health and well-being. We also know that there have been some steps backwards in terms of the progress we've seen in terms of gender diversity at work, about who is balancing work and caring. We always knew before that women were doing the bulk of work and caring in the workplace, and unfortunately that is exacerbated even more so. And we've also seen particular age groups disproportionately hit, and that has particularly hit older and higher risk workers as well. But there are opportunities with this change as well. So we've seen overnight that the technology, not always, and it's difficult sometimes, but it can work, and it can make a huge difference. People can work remotely, and a lot of the factors that people said it would never work in their teams, they can't work remotely, they can't work flexibly, overnight all those things change, and they did because they had to. And we've seen some of the breaking between the connection of what someone achieves at work, their outputs. It's not just about clocking in and out, it's about getting a job done and providing value to your employer, and getting a work-life balance as well. So we feel this gives us a bit of a chance to reset our practices. Whatever we go to with the new normal, whatever that may look like, we think that flexible working is going to be key to that. And we need to find practical answers to that. And that's why we were delighted to work with Timewise on a very practical toolkit, guidance, working with leading employers like Legal & General and Guy's and St Thomas's. And I'll just hand over now to Muriel, who saw us through this project and did the excellent work for Timewise on it.
Sorry, I've had a screen jam. Apologies about this. My screen seems blocked.
Mira, why don't you start talking? Just talk us through your findings. We may have slides.
So the program that we set out had three main objectives, really. The three objectives were about understanding what's happening on the ground in terms of employer attitudes and behaviours, understanding the working practices at the organisational level, and more specifically, the aspects of flexible job design that enable better flexible working for older workers. And finally, looking at how employers can be encouraged and supported to focus on better flexible working for this specific demographic. Hang on, I'm sorry to do that. So in terms of what we did, it was a two-phase program. The first phase was the insights phase, which is essentially a research piece, a 4-month program in which we worked with 6 large employers: Sodexo, Leeds City Council, McDonald's, Whitbread, Legal & General, and Guy's and St Thomas's. And we did a survey and ran a number of interviews and focus groups with over 50 workers, as well as line managers who had over 50s in their teams. And this really, the underpinning of this was to explore issues that pertain to this particular demographic, and such as life changes, the recognition of that, the validity of reasons that people might have for wanting flexible working, to raise awareness of flexible working for this group, and also to make some tangible changes for older workers in the organisations. And that led us to the second piece, which was the pilot phase. The pilot phase was done with 2 employers, that was Legal & General and Guy's and St Thomas's. And in this, we worked with a cohort of over 50s and their line managers who wanted to trial a 2-month period of a new flexible working pattern in which they would have specific training, support, resources, and to do this in the wider context of flexible working in the organisations. So what we learned in the insights phase, and apologies again about this being stuck, but in the insights phase, which was the research piece, survey and focus groups and interviews, what we found that despite the fact that the people we spoke to were from very different organisations, very different skill sets, very different roles, there was some differences, particularly with regards to retirement planning and what people wanted to do looking forward, but also there was a great degree of commonality. And I think it's this commonality that we really need to think about. So one of the first areas we looked at as to why people wanted flexible working. And this is interesting because, not surprisingly, a question, why do you want flexible working? I think about 3/4 said, for a better work-life balance. But also the other boxes they could tick were about health reasons and caring reasons, and wanting more time for themselves. And about 1 out of 3 people ticked those specific boxes. And underlying those responses, and this is really important, were personal stories. So people needed caring, time for caring for different reasons, perhaps an elderly parent going into hospital, perhaps becoming guardian of a grandchild. People wanted more time for themselves, perhaps to exercise or go to a physio on a regular basis, but also recognition that actually they value their time differently as they were getting older. So this is really important from an employer perspective, because having different reasons means you need to have a consistency in approach, but an openness to allow people to talk about what those reasons might be. equally having a reason neutral stance. So I think it's important to think about people need to be open to be able to talk about it. There needs to be a fluidity of approach as to when people can talk about it. And also it drives the type of flexibility that people might need. So what we learned when we talked to people about their experience of asking for flexible working or doing flexible working was they experienced different challenges, many of which are similar to those faced by their demographics. So that would be around the stigma, doing full-time work when you're being paid a part-time job, the difficulties around job design. But then there are also a number of other themes which emerged, which I think are important for this group. So firstly, I think it's important to note that most people had a good awareness of flexible working options that were available, but had more difficulty understanding what was possible in their role. Secondly, people were reasonably comfortable asking for flexible working, but were much more comfortable when they'd had a good relationship with their manager and also had informal conversations around it beforehand. I think the idea of validity of reason is really, really interesting. Some people felt a little bit cautious talking to their line managers, partly because they felt that those people would have had the same experience and it could be hard subjects to broach. But equally, what was consistent across all employers in this research piece was the appreciation of the older workers, the expertise, the experience, and the commitment that they bring to their roles. So in summary, what we found that flexible working for this over 50s demographic is the same as for other demographics. So core principles are similar, but there are some differences. It's what happens at the edges which is different. So that's around the reasons for needing flexibility, how easy it is to talk about flexibility, what sort of patterns work well and why, how flexibility can be used to plan towards retirement. It's much more critical at this stage, not surprisingly, and also how roles can be reconsidered over time, career management, career development, I think career design, to ensure that the value these workers bring to the role and to the employer are captured in the roles that are offered to them, the flexible roles that are offered. The next piece was the pilot program. So this is where we proceeded with Legal and General and with Guides and St. Thomas's to run a program which lasted about 8 months in total, and which was around supporting a self-selected group of over 50 workers who wanted to trial a new working pattern, a flexible working pattern. So underpinning this 5-stage program was good communication led by the senior sponsor. This is really, really important. Having an individual but consistent approach to supporting people to understand what sort of flexibility is possible in their role, supporting line managers as well as the employees themselves. I think it was really important to discuss the role in the context of what the team needs and what the business needs. So it's not about coming forward with why you need flexibility, but how the flexibility can be made to work for you and your employer. And then having a trial that's essential. And then finally following that up with support and guidance and further resources that could be used more widely within the organization. The outcomes of the pilots were really, really positive. So there was one group of people who tried job share, which was really good. There were no other part-time trials taking place, but most of them were compressed hours, staggered hours, working from home, and annualized hours as well. So it was a good, interesting mix of how people could be working differently. I think it was very positive from the line manager perspective. There was either no change in performance or actually improved performance. All of the participants felt that they had a better work-life balance than before. So really positive, and most of them went on to make those changes permanent. So finally, in terms of the lessons learned, I think these three probably fall into 3 different categories. The first is around reason neutrality, and this is really from the employer perspective. So it's really important that people don't feel their reason for needing flexibility needs to be valid, but often people want to talk about it, and often the nature of the reason helps determine what sort of flexibility can work well. It also means that from the employer perspective, it's important to give people the opportunity at different stages throughout the year to talk about what they might not need. So it's not just an annual process. The second piece was about job design, and this was really interesting, the sort of changes that people were asking for. And often people wanted to carry on working full time. So that makes it somewhat easier, I think, often from the employer perspective, but that actually small changes can actually have a really, really big impact on employee health and well-being. So that was really, really important. And the final point was around career management. So it's still important. It might not be seen as career progression or career development in the same way, but it's about ensuring that the skills you want to retain as an employer match up with the contribution that the individuals can make in their different working patterns, in different roles and at different times. So finally, I think we have sort of recommendations moving forward. What we'd say to employers is that it's important to start by defining the business case. So if you want to look at this, you know, look at the validity of doing this. So what are your reasons for enabling flex more widely? How about within your workforce? So what does your workforce data tell you? What are your workforce priorities? The second, after you've spent some time thinking about why you're going to do it, is look at your flexible working landscape, how it exists at the moment. You know, a key message is you really want to be encouraging flexibility across all demographics, and it might just need some nuanced changes to support this demographic, but it's really important when you set off on doing this is to assess your current level of competency and maturity in flexible working. How many people are working, what the uptake is, what the policy promotes, and then finally develop a program around that. And I think overall, it's a sort of learning for the over 50s, but more widely is that it's really about moving from being reactive to proactive, which I think a lot of employers are looking at the moment. It's about how a job can be done. So lead the conversation with how can this work be delivered, as opposed to why someone wants flexibility, and really to sort of set the tone being about, you know, flexible working should be an expectation, not an exception. So I think I'll stop there, hand back to Emma. Apologies again about the slides, but we will make them available. Thank you.
Thanks, Muriel. Thanks very much. And absolutely, we'll make sure we share all the slides with everybody after the session so you can see. But hopefully you managed to get some of those insights from the work. I'd now like to hand over to Philip. Philip's organisation, obviously Legal in General, were very active in the pilot, and we were delighted that they were happy to work with us on it. As I said at the beginning, we know Legal in General are good at flexible working. I think what we were particularly interested in was to understand, to Muriel's point, what happens around the edges was what were the particular sort of insights from taking a very age-specific approach to trying to explore how to enable people to work flexibly. Again, a lot of the work that we did, clearly most of the work we did was pre-pandemic. But if I hand over to Philip, I think he'll give some reflections on some insights from the work, but also really what's happening now in the context of COVID. So Philip, over to you.
Thanks, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. So, yeah, I think in terms of our reflections on the pilot work that we did, what I would say is that some of the points that Muriel voiced over there really resonate very loudly with Legal in General. The first point that particularly resonates, I think, is around the reason neutrality, as Muriel kind of phrased it. What we found is that our older workers felt that flexible working as a policy was intended for, targeted at, perhaps younger workers. So perhaps mums returning from having been on maternity leave and having childcare commitments, or indeed dads, actually, that wasn't strictly just a gender specific thing. Potentially people who wanted to do an element of study, so an additional MBA or something like that, and wanted to supplement that with different ways of working. But very much perhaps targeted at younger people. And there was a bit of an assumption with our older workers that in requesting flexible working, that would for them be very much that they would be seen as something of a minority or an exception, and that they perhaps might have to justify why they want to work more flexibly perhaps than one of those other groups. So somebody saying, oh, I've just had a baby, I'd like to come back part-time to sort of tick in the box, whereas I've hit 50, I have a different lifestyle now and I'd like to have a different balance, is perhaps something that they felt that line managers would probe more. And I think a key learning for me, and something that we've adapted, you know, in our conversations pretty much straight away, is to get to a stage where when somebody wants a conversation about flexible working, they're not asked to give the reason particularly. If they want to talk about it, clearly that's fine, but it's not part of the process to say, and why would you want this? The reality is that if we're going to support flexible working, it doesn't matter to us why the person wants to do it. It just matters to us to make sure that it fits and that it works. So that's really important. And for older workers specifically, some of the stigma and some of the challenges around that are particularly prevalent. So there's a view that as they get older, they feel a bit more threatened in the workplace by these bright young things coming through. And therefore, if they move to a part-time model or a more flexible model, they will be less visible in the office. They will have fewer opportunities to shine and impress, and therefore they're almost condemning themselves to be exited stage right, because they're almost suggesting that they're not as useful as they once were because they can do what they did in fewer hours. And I think being creative about the flexible working arrangements for the individuals is one way to crack that, but potentially to help think about that in terms of career management. So not just taking an existing role and doing it flexibly, but thinking about what a different role might look like. And if we're talking to older workers about roles where they are more consultative, more specialist, and perhaps particularly in our industry, able to really leverage their years of experience in a more targeted way, coupled with a more flexible working arrangement, I think that probably resonates quite well with them, because it feels as though there's good changes going in multiple directions. Our line managers felt that flexible working, they understand the commitment to it, but they didn't necessarily feel that they had the tooling to make it really successful. So generally, it was left to individuals who wanted to work flexibly to devise how they should work flexibly. So the narrative being the line manager would say, yes, of course you can work flexibly. Tell me how you'd like to do it and we'll see if it can work. And I don't think they felt that it was a collaborative piece. So certainly within the pilot group, we wanted line managers to think about how they co-create flexible working arrangements. Of course, I guess the COVID-19 pandemic has blown it all out of the water, because in essence, our definition of flexibility, in essence, changed overnight, because all the things that everybody had thought might be barriers to flexible working disappeared the night Boris went on television and told everyone you must now work from home. And people adapted to that very quickly. Our approach to flexibility in Legal and General held us in very good stead at that time. So what we said to people was, this is in effect a free rein on flexibility to a certain extent, in terms of you have to work out how you need this to work for you. So if you have childcare commitments, just help us understand when you can be available and when you can't. And all those different elements like that. And what it did is it amped up our flexibility 100, if not 1,000 times based on where it was, and was generally very, very successful. So what does that now mean? I would say in a post-pandemic world, clearly it's not post-pandemic world, but as we move into sort of different phases of this work, it's opened our eyes far more and far more widely across the group to the possibilities of flexible working, such that we've triggered a Future of Work initiative to really think about how we harness all the good stuff we've learned through the pandemic and we don't lose it. In some ways, it's also resulted in some very interesting shifts in the dynamics, which have created something of a dichotomy for us, particularly if we think through the lens of older workers. So whereas perhaps before the older workers felt that flexible working was just for the younger folk, the pandemic has sort of shifted that around. And now if I had a concern, it would be that our younger workers are potentially going to be left behind a little bit, because most of our older workers have various things in common insofar as that they probably have decent sized houses, decent space to work from home, potentially a dedicated office or at least a dedicated space, perhaps less likely to have young children running around at home, and actually are just physically more capable of doing the working from home given their income and their homes. And having now been given that opportunity to work from home all the time, a significant proportion of them have said, I like this and I've made this work and now I want this to be the new normal. And of course, we have no reason to stop that if they are fully effective. And in fact, I think that's fantastic. But our younger demographic, our new entrants, our graduates, people who are in different circumstances, don't necessarily have those facilities to work flexibly. So ironically, there's now potentially a risk that it's the older workers that set the agenda for the business, perhaps a bit too stoically in terms of this commitment to flexible working. And there's a risk that we leave our younger workers behind because if it's possible, and I don't think it is, but we're too flexible. But our antidote to that for me in terms of our future of work strategy is to stop thinking in extremes, and irrespective of whatever the media narrative is saying, this is not about everybody working from home or everybody working in the office. It is about that true balance, about all the different roles we have and all the different people we have and all their different needs, having an operating model where people can work as flexibly as they need to on that scale. Some people who now want to work from home all the time beyond the pandemic and proven it can work, why would we stop that? People who thrive in the office and on the interactions with people in the office, let's make sure they're doing the right sort of role, so they're not doing work that perhaps is best placed to be done out of the office in this new model. But let's think about what they need and the flexible working arrangements they need to support that. So I probably never expected with this conversation, if I'd have predicted it months ago, to be talking about a model where we have to make sure the balance is in the favour of younger workers potentially. But that is an interesting outcome from the pandemic, that we may be, particularly in financial services, slightly over influenced by older workers who really can work from home very, very easily. I think the issue of career management is also vital in this, which is that where we need to move from is not necessarily conversations where people take an existing role and then one day come into the office and say, I'd like to do this flexibly now, please, because it's quite sudden and perhaps not easy to plan for. It's about making sure that flexible working is absolutely on the agenda with conversations between line managers and their people all the time. So it's a growing story. You know, I'm in a year or so's time, I may feel differently about this, and perhaps we can start to think about a more flexible arrangement then, because it helps everybody consider what that might mean. But also finding a much stronger link between changes in working arrangements and career development. I think we will struggle to have a model where people are entirely comfortable taking the job they do now and just starting to do it more flexibly until the world has moved on a bit. But if we can talk to people about the job they do now and the sort of job that they might like to do and how that might be more flexible and might drive more value to the business, that's a bit of a win-win-win, because it's evolving the career of the individual, it's evolving the operating model and the strategic workforce plan for the team, and it's actually about supporting line managers to accept that it's not just about retrofitting what you've got, but it's about shaping the long-term needs of your team. That's probably my main reflections. Emma, hopefully that was useful and a good summary of where we got to.
That was great, Philip. Thank you very much. Really, really helpful, and begs quite a few questions, I think. Can I bring everybody back in on video now, in terms of panel, Muriel, Patrick and Anna Maria as well? We have probably, I think we'll aim for an hour here, so we've probably got about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. I'd like to kick off. I've got a couple of questions to ask, and then if anybody else, having heard the presentations, would like to ask any questions, please do pop them in the chat function now. We'll start thinking about them, and we're happy to open it up to a broader discussion. I guess my first question is probably more pointed to Philip and Anna Maria, which is, we know pre-pandemic there was a sort of a sense, and some of the data supports this, that financial services were not as maybe open to flex as some other sectors, in terms of issues around gender, in terms of issues around age, and just the general sort of culture and operational practices. Obviously, things have massively shifted over the last 6 months. But I just wondered whether, in the context of that, to your point, Philip, if we think about where we go next, whether you do feel that there are, within financial services specifically, any particular barriers that we are going to still need to address, whether it's operational, whether it's cultural. And I guess what your sort of hope is for the sort of post-pandemic. Do you feel the catch-up will happen, or do you think there are still some other work that we need to do, particularly in this industry, in this sector? Maybe Phil, can I come to you first, and then Anna Maria for your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly the pandemic challenged any perception that roles generally within financial services couldn't be done flexibly. I mean, overnight in legal and general, probably 97% of our people started to work from home and to work in very flexible ways. And the very, very small minority of roles that couldn't be were things like, for example, where we're processing customer post, and we have some vulnerable customers who will never go fully digital. So we have to have people sorting post and dealing with those customers and so on and so forth. But roles that perhaps we hadn't invested so heavily in working flexibly in terms of home working, such as contact centres, etc., we shifted overnight. So any perhaps challenge that we couldn't work flexibly, for me, is gone. I draw a line under that as far as legal and general is concerned, to say that this is, we've proven that. Don't anybody come and suggest that we can't, do things flexibly. And that actually what the crisis proved is how quickly we can adapt as well. Because if we'd have initiated programs around this where people said, oh, there'll be a change cycle and we'll have to move people through this over an 18-month period. And okay, a crisis is a slight extreme, but the speed with which we moved through that was quite significant. I think where pressure comes from is how we find the balance about not being too extreme and suddenly having everybody working at home in such flexible ways that we lose our culture, we lose our identity, and we lose our sense of belonging. Because those are the things that probably people are now missing because they're spending so much time at home. So models where, for me, I would almost badge it as running our business from home, growing, evolving, and changing our business from workspaces where people come together is quite a nice way to look at it, and finding how people can fit into that. The only other pressure I would add, and then I'll let someone else get a word in edgeways, is that perhaps there is a perception that financial services just still need a really strong presence in the city, and there's a symbolic of our economy and our strength of financial income. And I get that. That's not something that's necessarily to be just outright dismissed. But what we've got to do is to find how we restore some of that balance without, again, going to extremes.
Interesting. Sense of place. Yes, thank you. Anna Maria, have you got any thoughts, particularly in the context of this industry, this sector?
Yes, thank you, Emma. I think it's a really interesting question, and I would agree strongly with Philip that our industry probably needs to sort of stop looking at things from extreme angles. So I think from what we can see from our diversity project member firms, but also from my work through Ludgate Search, it really there's sort of firms are at different points on their flexible working journey. Obviously, Legal & General is one of those firms that has been looking into flexible working for many, many years now. So I think the way Philip described your project and how it benefited them will definitely be insightful and hopefully inspirational for a lot of firms that are maybe really resorting to a quick fix and trying to get employees, as many of the employees, quickly back to the office. So I think it's all about really these firms and leaders being more proactive and have this strategic view of flexible working really being the tool to build back better. And I think this is something that we often describe and discuss at the Diversity Project. How can the leaders and managers across organization really use this period as a huge learning opportunity to really drive and accelerate change? And I truly believe that firms that don't utilize this to implement really sustainable and effective flexible working practices that would encourage all the bits that Philip has kindly kind of talked through in terms of this being reason neutral and included in job by default and so on, that they would lose competitive advantage. Not only that's going to be visible in their bottom lines, I do believe in the medium term, but also in their retention and attraction of talent. And I think we, as an industry, we've managed to extend the old ways of working as long as we could, but we're at a tipping point. So, I think I would really urge leaders to, sort of embed flexible working in their D&I agenda, prioritize it, because as we know, there's numerous studies that really show that this can increase inclusion and diversity for all groups. So the challenges are there. I mean, there are the usual presenteeism and long hours and just willingness to keep to the old ways of working. So I don't think it's pretty simple, but we tend to overcomplicate. So I think we just need to look up to groups such as Legal & General, a few other groups that I've mentioned, and also some example out of the industry. Emma, I think you, Timewise has worked with Shell and Lloyd's banking group and Unilever. If we look at a few other industries that have really implemented all the suggestions that you've discussed today, they're really thriving. And I think PwC was one of the firms that also stated that because of their effective, D&I and flexible working, they actually managed to save millions and millions in profit. So I think business case is there. I just hope firms will really utilize this time for long-term change.
Thank you. And it's interesting, I think I'd say we see the same. I think there's a leadership piece as opposed to a sectoral piece. But certainly our reflections from the range of companies that we've been working with is, I think if you were vanguard when it comes to flex and you put some of those tools in place and some of those cultures, the cultural practice in place, I think you're finding COVID okay when it comes to making the adjustments. I think if you hadn't embraced flex, I think it is really challenging. And we were seeing pre the last announcement, a lot of D&I teams coming to us saying, we've been asked to present to Exco and say exactly how we're going to go back. Is it 2 days in the office and 3 days or whatever? So I think there's a lot of revert to type, which we've just got to be mindful of as well. I think you're right. I'm going to ask one more question to everybody on the panel, and then I'm going to bring in some questions that we've had in the chat function. So thank you, people, for contributing. It's a question about visibility. Philip, you mentioned that sort of sense that there's a bit of a stigma, particularly amongst sort of older workers who may feel that they might get parked or sidelined if they start working less. Obviously, there's another layer on top of this with COVID, which is we're all less visible in theory. I mean, we're all flat and on screens, but some of us are at home. Some of us are coming back into the office. So I guess I'm kind of interested in that, in how you, as a panel, think about the importance of retaining visibility, in particular in the context of career progression, and particularly thinking about that part-time issue, because it's one of the things that we found at Timewise it's really challenging, which is if you become less visible either working from home or you become less visible because you're working less, to what can businesses and organisations do to mitigate against that when it comes to helping people to still think about career progression? Philip, can I come to you first?
I think it's a really interesting question. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately. If I did, I'd be a multimillionaire, I suspect. But I think one of the things that is worth thinking about is how much visibility is linked to presenteeism and is conceptually, therefore, out of date. Insofar as that if we're going to move to a business where we measure the impact of our people based on their outcomes and what they do, then their visibility as people in terms of human interactions takes on a different kind of level of importance, I guess, would be my first observation. But we've started to do lots of round virtual tables clearly, with our people on this to talk about this and see where perhaps their anxieties lie, and not just our older workforce, our entire workforce, and how we can find other ways to be visible. And in many ways that comes down to good people management, a good approach to managing talent, and thinking about how we identify opportunities for people in conjunction with them, because the visibility issue is predominantly around career management. So if we find lots of ways to have richer career management conversations and build those connections in a more virtual world, then, and balanced with the real world, i.e. people still coming together and having that visibility when they're collaborating and doing stuff in the office, I think we can find a good balance. But first and foremost, I would say that we must focus on measuring people's contribution based on the outcomes they deliver and what they do, as opposed to focusing too much on visibility, because it still links to presenteeism in a way.
Thank you.
Actually, could I add to that, Emma? Because I've got a great example of someone in Legal and General who took part in the pilot, who was senior program manager, highly regarded in the team and by her line manager. And she wanted to do a compressed week. You know, she still had children at home and wanted to have a little bit more time, but didn't want to go part-time, and nor did she want to lose status. And it wasn't sort of status, it was more about getting big, meaty, chunky projects and involvement in that. And she moved to a compressed week. So she did her 5 days in 4 days and was really, really satisfied with it. I think what made that work really well is just what you picked up on there very clearly, Phil, which was the clarity of expectations of the outcomes of the role. So her manager said, I expect exactly the same outcomes and the same level of performance, and she knows that I expect that. It was sort of the planning and focus that both the line manager and the employee showed as well. She said she became much more particular about which meetings she went to, and didn't waste time doing bits. I think also the quality of the relationship they had and the conversations they could have. So I think to go from, you know, what sounds like a long hours role with quite high performance expectations, going from a 5-day to doing that same role in 4 days, they really made it work. So, you know, it's definitely possible.
And the quality of the relationship is key, actually. I think that's a really good point.
It's an interesting point. Just, we often talk about a sort of non-conversation at Timewise, which is there's often an assumption that managers don't expect people want to work differently because people don't say they want to work differently. People say they don't say they want to work differently because they're not sure the manager will say yes. So I think one of the things that COVID has done is kind of turn that sort of non-conversation into quite an honest, forced conversation, because we're all having to talk about it now. And I think it's, yeah, there's only going to be positives, as you say, from a relational perspective. Anybody else? Patrick, I don't know if you want to come in, or Anna Maria, and thoughts on that sort of visibility point. Maybe Patrick, in terms of wider experience around older workers in the space.
Yes, I mean, the only one I'd add to that is the bit on the visibility is now, right now, when many more people are working remotely, you're not missing out so much by being the one person in the corner of the room who's coming in via a laptop when everyone else is in the room. So it's much more equitable that way, that everyone is doing it this way. So then you're not the last one to be thought about because you're dialing in. And I'd also just reflect on what Phil was saying there before about there are different experiences of this based on your age, based on the type of home you live in, what you've got going on in terms of busyness, in terms of the size of your home, in terms of if you've got young children, other things like that. I think the other really key difference in terms of age is we really find that there's a lot of transfer knowledge happens between younger and older age groups in the workplace, and that doesn't happen as much when people aren't physically together. So you get less of those water cooler moments, you get less of those picking up on experience, doing by seeing what other people around you are doing. So I wonder if that is another thing that is changing a little bit now that, you know, younger members of staff who might be wanting to learn from older members of staff simply aren't seeing each other around an office environment as much as you might have done before.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions, so I am going to start. I will ask a couple. If people do want to speak, then very happy for you to do so. Maybe just sort of let me know in the chat function. But I'm going to start. So Jane has a question. Miriam, I'm going to point it at you. She wanted to know, when you were talking about small changes to job designs that were very positive. If you can just give a couple of examples of what some of those small changes might be.
So this was really interesting, and this happened both in Legal and General and Guy's and St. Thomas's, that it was startling what a sort of small change in a working pattern, what a big impact it could have on the individual's work-life balance, and with no adverse or even improved performance outcomes. So two specific examples which come to mind, which are very different, but I think makes them more interesting, is one person who was working in a call center who wanted to change the hours that she was working. So rather than sort of 8 to 4, wanted to be able to come in earlier and leave slightly earlier to have more time in the evening with her partner. And also, she said, growing older, actually, she was awake bright and early and actually felt she could work better early in the morning. And so, but obviously in a call center could be a little bit difficult, but her line manager with one of the other team line managers sat together and looked to see how that having a staggered hour, so early start, early finish, could be covered by other team members, and everyone was happy with that. They did that on a team basis. And also, what other pockets of work were there before the call center opened? And funnily enough, I think, Phil, you said early on something about the post. This person then picked up some more role to do with the post, opening the post and distributing that. So actually, they worked across 2 teams. They did it collaboratively, and it was a small change in the working hours, the time of the working hours, but it made a really, really big difference for the employee. And the second, which was very different, and I thought, gosh, why didn't they talk about this earlier? But it was a senior relationship manager who lived, I think, in the southeast, but had to work up north. And after lunchtime on Sunday, was starting to think about the working week and traveled. It was several hours journey every Sunday afternoon, evening up north, and then was based up there and traveled around a little bit. But then talked to the line manager and decided he would go for a compressed week, work slightly longer hours during the week, but have that Monday morning as time to travel. So effectively, it was a really small change. You know, he just took the Monday for traveling time as opposed to the Sunday afternoon and evening, and had a huge impact on his personal life, his family life, the time he spent with his family. So really small changes, and what they needed was an understanding of what the role was about and what the person needed. And I think also that collaborative approach between the manager and the individual and, you know, the rest of the team.
Thanks, Miriam. I'm going to bounce the other way now from micro to macro. I've had a couple of questions around COVID. So I'm going to try and sort of bring them together. So one from Helen and one from Nikki. So Helen's question, which probably more directed to you, Patrick, which was, we talked about older workers being impacted and disproportionately impacted by COVID, and just if you can sort of talk a little bit about what you're seeing across the board in terms of the concerns for older workers in relation to COVID and work. And the sort of link to that is, Nikki's question is, and it builds on some of the comments you made, Anna Maria and also Philip, around what are the positives from COVID that we have to hold on to and make sure we maintain when we come out of this pandemic. So Patrick, can I start with you, just the kind of thoughts on the kind of wider negative impact that on work that COVID's having on older workers?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it goes without saying there's been just this bombshell in the labour market with what's happened with the economic impacts of COVID, and it has absolutely affected all age groups, but in different ways. And I think certainly we are about supporting people in midlife, people as they age in the workplace, but we'd be, disingenuous to say that things haven't also impacted younger age groups as well. So I think there's a risk of having a lost generation of people who were entering the labour market. They aren't getting the skills available of starting out in work. But having said that, we've also done a lot of analysis, and in one of the answers on the chat box, I've put a link there to some research we've done looking at the impact of previous downturns, and particularly how people in their 50s and 60s are more likely to be made redundant or in sectors that are impacted by redundancy. And then if they do lose their job, they find it the most challenging to get back into work, and it takes them longer to. And particularly if you think of someone who's maybe at around about the age of 60, there is also a creeping kind of ageism that comes in there as well. So people are less likely to be offered a job, and particularly offered a full-time permanent role as well. So it is a really challenging situation. And the final piece of work that I'll just mention is we funded the Institute for Fiscal Studies to look at people's changing retirement decisions as well. And COVID has already impacted that. So 1 in 8 people over the age of 50 have changed their retirement plans, either bring them forward or backwards because of COVID, because of the impacts on their savings or their health or work or other things as well. So it has changed things dramatically, but we also hope there is opportunity for positive change there as well.
Thank you. Anybody have thoughts on what do we need to hold on to in terms of the positives?
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. So there's a few positives for me. Firstly, I think what the pandemic has brought teams closer together, ironically, in some ways, that teams that were potentially in the office together have said to me that when they're now working virtually, they know each other better than they did before, which I thought was really, really interesting, because they've taken time to find out about each other. And some of the time they've spent on Zoom calls when they've been having a themed Mexican afternoon and stuff like that has actually helped them learn about each other and build a much greater sense of team identity. I think the element of the crisis forces people to want to do that. They feel like they have to have an antidote to that as well. Obviously, it's proven that every role can be done flexibly. I hate to state the obvious, but of course that's perhaps the most important thing. But also a number of our people have said that it's transformed the relationship they have with their family and with their home. Those are quite powerful statements. So I feel a little bit this way on the latter, which is that home was probably somewhere where I got home in the evening, had something to eat, relaxed a bit, slept, and then left in the morning. So it's more of a house, I guess. Now it feels like my home. I appreciate it more when I'm here, and I've created more of my space, and I've appreciated the light in certain rooms, and I've appreciated that one room is good for working at some time of day, and it's changed that relationship. And obviously an awful lot of people have said that they've appreciated seeing elements of their children growing up this year that they realised with hindsight they would have just missed. So our chief financial officer commented that he was currently in the summer, clearly, was spending his lunchtimes playing football with his 2 young boys, and he suddenly realised that all the time he was commuting into London every single day, he wouldn't have done that. And now he thinks back to all the things he's potentially missed. And those are great employee stories to fuel the argument to maintain this degree of flexibility, even though we do miss lots of elements of office working as well.
Thank you. I've got another question from Helen. So one which we know a lot about, Helen, I have to say it time-wise in relation, and I know Anna Maria does as well. So Anna Maria, I'm going to ask this one to you. Helen's question is, what would you suggest that we change in job ads to make them more clearly flexible? given that everybody wants a different type of flexibility, so you don't want to restrict the candidate pool by being too specific. So, so as someone who deals with candidates day in, day out, what are your thoughts on, because obviously we're all advocating for what we would at times call flexible hiring, which is you open up the jobs market to people who want to move and take that flexibility with them, and we would hope you will as a result of this period of time. And just to say, from our own data, we know that only 15% of job vacancies across the UK pre-COVID had any reference to flex. So clearly nowhere near enough when 9 out of 10 people want to work flexibly, or maybe 10 out of 10. Anne-Marie, your thoughts on how, what do you say and how do you say it?
So it's a very good question, and it's something that obviously our industry needs to be better at. But I don't think we need to be too worried about what we say and how we say it. I think it's about flexibility being at the core of your organizational culture. And when you talk about your core values as an organization, this is something that should be included in those statements, and then quite clearly saying, roles are flexible, and this is something we can discuss at the interview process. I think we shouldn't be too worried the way we say it, but as long as we say it, and that could then be defined depending on the organization. And this is something each organization really need to think about, because yes, we should adapt to individuals as per our conversation. We need to be asking those questions at the beginning of the interview process, at the application, as well as throughout the appraisals. But really, it's about how you frame it for your organizational culture, because there's no one size fit all. But the key really is that you make that statement. I'm just conscious that if suddenly, Emma, as you said, sort of 85% of employers don't advertise flexible working, if everyone does, but they haven't really ingrained it in their culture, and they haven't trained line managers on how to manage flexible working workforce, how to have these proactive conversations, and if their leaders are not role modeling and championing flexible working at the core of their organization, then I would be slightly concerned about those people coming in and then feeling disappointed that actually that organization doesn't fully support it. So I think that the question is important, but that's the smallest thing that you can sort of adopt. It's more about the actual culture, because if you do hire somebody that thinks is joining a flexible organization, and then that doesn't really transpire in practice, then you'll have a much larger issue. And as we discussed before, it will have an impact on your bottom line. But I guess that to sort of sum this up, the only other thing to really focus on is the output. So, and really thinking creatively about how you can utilize the talent for really new ways of working. So,
thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts just on what to say?
Yeah, if I could just chip in there from some of the conversations that we had during both the research and also during the pilot. It's interesting. I agree with you completely, Anna Maria. It's about feeling confident that you've got some flexible working culture there. But then equally, there are opportunities, I think, to take baby steps, and certainly within certain teams. And while you'll want line managers to be supportive of flexible working, they often find it a little bit difficult to talk about it and are worried that people will come to them with requests and demands in those first interviews. So I think if in adverts you can express an openness to flexible working, which could be as simple as, we're open to talk flex. I know there was a strap line coming through from one of the organizations, which was, if we can make it work for the business, we can make it work for you. And something like that in an ad already puts something really positive forward. And I think quite often, managers are pleasantly surprised when they find they get really good candidates coming forward who talk about their skills, lead with their experience. And then a little bit further on, there comes a conversation. Okay, we know you can do the job. Now let's talk about how you can do the job. So I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it.
It's an interesting one. I have to say, we talk a lot about the sort of when to have the conversation as a candidate. And I think just that calling card, you're right, I would endorse what you've both said. You have to have the processes right, because what you don't want is a bad candidate experience where someone asks for 4 days and no one knows how to redesign the job to be done on 4 days, and they say yes and then they end up working 5. But equally, by putting that calling card out there, candidates feel they can apply. And I would hope that in in a new labour market that we're in, that is still something that employers will want to do and will think to do. Just for everyone's information, we produce an index every year that tracks the state of the flexible vacancy market, and we'll be publishing this year's one at the end of this year, at the end of November. And we are going to be really interested to see, we're looking at pre-COVID, during lockdown and post-lockdown, what employers are saying on their job ads when it comes to flexibility. So it'll be really, really interesting to see whether this whole remote working experiment has encouraged more employers to be open to flex at the point of hire. I think we've got time for one more question, and then I'm going to wrap things up. It's a meaty one from Brian. Patrick, I'm going to come to you because it's policy related. So Brian's question is, he wants to know if there is a need to lobby government and possibly even HMRC to think about either individual or company taxation, or maybe business incentives to help extend more flexible working practices, in particular about preserving jobs in a post-COVID world. Brian, I'm not sure if you're referring to obviously the government's new job support scheme, which I think I would say from our perspective, from a policy view at time-wise, is slightly a missed opportunity when it comes to part-time, because it is going to cost businesses more to keep 2 part-timers than to hire 1 full-timer. But Patrick, I don't know, maybe a wider sort of view on the pros, opportunities for legislation in this space, whether you think that is needed and whether it would work. And then I'm going to come to Pat to Philip for a view as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big one. In terms of policy changes we could see, I mean, there's a whole range of things around the move to lifelong learning. And I think things around ensuring that career progression, development, training, those things are all available to you no matter what your age is. So there's an element of government support there, particularly through funding or access to other schemes as well. I think in terms of flexible working, there are definitely opportunities out there. And Emma, talking to you in previous things as well, there are, the government is looking at an employment bill. They're looking at their carers policy, the carers aspects of that as well. They're also looking at flexible working within that. I think that can all really help and is important symbolically, but ultimately people have the right to request flexible working already, and ultimately it's gonna work or not based on what employers do. So I think it's definitely a government angle that we can be pursuing, but ultimately I think employers need to see the case themselves and want to make it work, in particular. But where people are not following the legislation properly, we should be taking them up as well on that. In terms of things around taxation and business incentives as well, I mean, government have already pulled the biggest lever they can, which is they're starting to raise the state pension age, and that's the biggest thing we've seen, which has changed people's attitudes or expectations about working for longer. We just have to make sure that people aren't only working for longer because they feel they have to financially. There also has to be a positive drive to it as well.
Thank you. Philip, any thoughts on whether anything like that would incentivize businesses to do things more faster?
I think there's definitely something in that. There's the contractual relationship between an employee and a place of work. At the moment is an interesting challenge. There's a tax implication from having everybody contractually based at home. That needs to be explored so that we don't let a taxation system hold up what's right for people. I'm sympathetic to the government position on the very complicated nature of this, that, for example, much more flexible working creates a potential challenge for things like TfL and public transport to run effectively if the number of people using it drops and maintains at sort of mid-COVID-19 levels, of course. And London, even now, as a specific example, obviously the trains, the tubes and so on and so forth are all quite quiet, and that's not necessarily sustainable. I don't think the answer is just to force people to go back into the office because it seems to counter other stuff. So we do need to look at the whole picture there and think about the positive environmental benefits of that, and I suppose in some ways redistributing stuff to make sure that we've restored the balance in other ways. I don't particularly feel that there's a really compelling need for the government to legislate and demand more rigor on flexible working for employers, because frankly, the way it stands, it provides a competitive advantage for those employers that really embrace it. So therefore, there's a bit of natural selection there to a certain extent in terms of, do it really well and your business thrives, and therefore there's a really strong incentive to do it. Of course, COVID-19 has triggered all sorts of new demands and needs from people. So it needs to be looked at very, very carefully. So it's quite complex. But I guess conceptually and spiritually, if businesses are absolutely behind the idea of encouraging flexible working, there's more than enough they can be getting on with for now, whilst we work our way through the pandemic and beyond, because there's a lot of uncertainty still.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Thank you. I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. I think we've tried to ask most of them. Those that we haven't asked, we will endeavour to type some answers in for you. I'd like to thank our panel, Philip, Anna Maria, Muriel, Patrick, for what's been a very broad-ranging debate and some really interesting findings, I hope, for everybody in relation to the pilot work that we've done. I guess just sort of summing up, some thoughts. I think we all have recognised what older workers want is what everyone wants, which is the ability to balance work and everything outside of work in a sustainable way that is healthy and gives us a decent work-life balance. I think what the work has shown us is that they don't always ask, and it's sometimes the small things and what happens around this that really matter, and the power of that relationship between a manager and an employee, and the culture that sits around that enables some of those smaller conversations to happen, to just give people some slight changes to the way they work, to enable them to perform at the best way they possibly can. And we know this isn't an issue that's going away. We know COVID has kind of exploded those small conversations into many, many small conversations. And I hope they will continue. In terms of practical resources, we will circulate the details to all of you who attended of the report, so you can have a full read of it. There is a toolkit in there which we have produced with Centre for Aging Better. Anna Maria, I think, has posted, and we'll also remind everybody of the Manifesto for Change that Timewise has produced with Diversity Project. And that has some very sort of tangible recommendations for organisations for how to shift the dial in terms of flexibility for the long term. But thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel, as I said. We hope it's given you some food for thought. It's a busy, complicated, complex world out there, but we all need to look after ourselves, and hopefully going forward we can retain some of the good, hard-won flexibility that we are having now, and go forward with that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.